A very good morning to all. Today we are gathered here to celebrate the life of a remarkable economist who lived amongst us and has left behind a great legacy. Welcome to the second memorial lecture commemorating Professor K.K. George and his incredible journey. The first memorial lecture, organized in 2022, was delivered by Professor Pinagi Chakrabarti, who was a former director at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi. Professor Dr. K.K. George, mostly being known among the peers and academicians as KKG. He was an outstanding economist, deeply interested in public finance, welfare, and development economics. He passed away on August 11, 2022. He has done commendable work on center-state relations and contributed immensely to debates on Kerala's development. Professor George retired as a director of the School of Management Studies at Cochin University of Science and Technology. He was also the founding chairperson of the Center for Socio-economic and Environmental Studies, CSES, Kochi. So let's formally proceed with a memorial lecture. For that I request Mr. Bibin Thampi, Senior Research Officer, CSES, for delivering the welcome address. Sir, please.
പ്രിയമുള്ളവരെ, ജോർജ് സാർ നമ്മെ വിട്ട് പിരിഞ്ഞിട്ട് ഒരു വർഷം പൂർത്തിയായ ഈ വേളയിലാണ് രണ്ടാമത് കെ കെ ജോർജ് അനുസ്മരണ പ്രഭാഷണം ഇവിടെ സംഘടിപ്പിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നത്. ജോർജ് സാറിനെ പലർക്കും പല രീതിയിലാണ് അനുഭവവേദിയായിട്ടുള്ളത്. ചിലർക്കത് ഒരു കരുതലിൻ്റെ കരസ്പർശമായിട്ടാണെങ്കിൽ, പോരാടുന്നവർക്ക് ചിലപ്പോൾ ഊർജമായിട്ടായിരിക്കും. ദീർഘദർശിയായ ഒരു സാമൂഹിക ശാസ്ത്രജ്ഞനായിട്ടാണ് മറ്റു ചിലർക്ക് സാറിനെ അനുഭവവേദ്യമായിട്ടുള്ളത്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ നല്ലൊരു ഉപദേഷ്ടാവ് എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിലും സാറ് അനുഭവവേദ്യമായിട്ടുള്ള നിരവധി ആളുകൾ നമ്മുടെ മുന്നിലുണ്ട്. സാർ മുന്നോട്ട് വെച്ച ഗവേഷണ താല്പര്യങ്ങൾക്കും ചിന്താധാരകളെയും കൂടുതൽ ശക്തിയോടുകൂടി മുന്നോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുപോകുന്നതിനുള്ള ഒരു ഊർജം ഇത്തരം അവസരങ്ങൾ നമുക്ക് പ്രദാനം ചെയ്യുമെന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നു. സാറിൻ്റെ ഔദ്യോഗിക ജീവിതത്തിൽ അവസാനമായി ഡയറക്ടറായിരുന്ന CUSATലെ സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് മാനേജ്മെൻറ്റ് സ്റ്റഡീസും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ കെ എൻ രാജിൻ്റെ പേരിലുള്ള MG യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിലെ ഡോക്ടർ കെ എൻ രാജ് സെൻറ്ററും, സെൻറ്റർ ഫോർ സോഷ്യോ-എക്കണോമിക് ആൻഡ് എൻവയോൺമെൻറ്റൽ സ്റ്റഡീസ് ജോർജ് സാർ അവസാന ശ്വാസം വരെ ചെയർമാനായി പ്രവർത്തിച്ച CSESഉം സംയുക്തമായി സംഘടിപ്പിക്കുന്ന രണ്ടാമത് കെ കെ ജോർജ് അനുസ്മരണ പ്രഭാഷണമാണ് ഇന്നിവിടെ നടക്കുന്നത്. ഈ ഫംഗ്ഷനിലേക്ക് ഇവിടെ കൂടിയിരിക്കുന്ന എല്ലാവരെയും, സദസ്സിലും വേദിയിലുമുള്ള മുഴുവൻ പേരെയും ഈ എല്ലാ സംഘാടകർക്കും വേണ്ടി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. സാറിനെ ഏറെ സ്നേഹിക്കുന്ന സാറിൻ്റെ സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾ, ഒപ്പം പ്രവർത്തിച്ചവർ, കുടുംബാംഗങ്ങൾ, ബന്ധുമിത്രാദികൾ തുടങ്ങി പലരാലും സമ്പന്നമാണ് ഇന്നത്തെ ഇവിടുത്തെ ഈ സദസ്സും വേദിയുമല്ല. സാറിനെ കൂടുതൽ അറിയുന്നത്, പുതിയ തലമുറയിലുള്ള വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾക്ക് സാറിനെ കൂടുതൽ അറിയുന്നതിനും സാറിൻ്റെ ചിന്താധാരകളെ മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നതിനും സാറിൻ്റെ അക്കാദമികമായിട്ടുള്ള സംഭാവനകൾ മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നതിനുമെല്ലാം ഈ ഒരു വേദി കൂടുതൽ പ്രചോദനം നൽകും എന്നും കൂടി ഞാൻ വിശ്വസിക്കുകയാണ്. ഈ അനുസ്മരണ പരിപാടിയുടെ അധ്യക്ഷത വഹിക്കുന്നത് നമുക്ക് ഏവർക്കും സുപരിചിതനായിട്ടുള്ള കൊച്ചിൻ ശാസ്ത്ര സാങ്കേതിക സർവകലാശാലയുടെ ഓണറബിൾ വൈസ് ചാൻസലറായിട്ടുള്ള PG ശങ്കരൻ സാറാണ്. ശങ്കരൻ സാറിനെ ഞാൻ ഈ വേദിയിലേക്ക് ഹർദവുമായി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. അനുസ്മരണ പ്രഭാഷണം നടത്തുന്നതിന് വേണ്ടി നമ്മോടൊപ്പം ഉള്ളത് പ്രമുഖ സാമൂഹ്യ ശാസ്ത്രജ്ഞനായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രൊഫസർ CP ചന്ദ്രശേഖറാണ്. നിലവിൽ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റി ഓഫ് മസാച്യുസെറ്റ്സ് ആംസ്റ്റർഡാമിലെ പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ ഇക്കോണമി റിസർച്ച് ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂട്ടിൽ സീനിയർ റിസർച്ച് ഫെലോയായി പ്രവർത്തിക്കുന്ന അദ്ദേഹം അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ കഴിഞ്ഞ ദീർഘകാലം 30 അധികം വർഷങ്ങളോളം ജെഎൻയുവിലെ സെന്റർ ഫോർ എക്കണോമിക് സ്റ്റഡീസ് ആൻഡ് പ്ലാനിങ്ങിലെ പ്രൊഫസറായും സേവനമനുഷ്ഠിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതുകൂടാതെ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റി ഓഫ് ലണ്ടനിൽ വിസിറ്റിംഗ് സീനിയർ ലെക്ചറായും, അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഈ പരിപാടിയുടെ സംഘാടകരുമായിട്ടുള്ള ഡോക്ടർ KN രാജ് സെന്ററിലെ മാൽക്കം ആദിശേഷ്യ ചെയർ പ്രൊഫസറായും സേവനമനുഷ്ഠിച്ചു വരുന്നു. സാറ് കേന്ദ്ര സംസ്ഥാന ബന്ധങ്ങൾ എന്ന വിഷയത്തിൽ വളരെയധികം സംഭാവനകൾ ജോർജ് സാറിന്റെ ഭാഗത്തു നിന്നുണ്ടായിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഇതേ വിഷയത്തിൽ നിന്ന് തന്നെ സാർ നടത്തുന്ന ഇന്നത്തെ പ്രഭാഷണം കേൾക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി ഞങ്ങൾ എല്ലാവരും കാത്തിരിക്കുകയാണ്. സാറിനെ വളരെ സ്നേഹത്തോടുകൂടി ഹർദവമായ ഈ വേദിയിലേക്ക് സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. സാറിനെ അനുസ്മരിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഇന്നിവിടെ സംസാരിക്കുന്നത് കേരള ചരിത്ര ഗവേഷണ കൗൺസിൽ ചെയർമാനും പ്രൊഫസർ PK മൈക്കത്തരൻ സാറാണ്. സാർ ഉടനെ എത്തും എന്ന് പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കുന്നു. സാർ ഉടനെ തന്നെ എത്തും. വളരെ കാലം ജോർജ് സാറുമായി സാർ ഒരുമിച്ച് പ്രവർത്തിക്കുകയും ഒക്കെ ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ള വളരെ അടുത്ത ബന്ധം സൂക്ഷിച്ചിരുന്ന മൈക്കത്തരൻ സാറിനെ ഞാൻ ഈ ഇതിലേക്ക് സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. അതോടൊപ്പം സാറിനെ അനുസ്മരിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് സംസാരിക്കുന്നത് സാർ തന്നെ ഡയറക്ടറായിരുന്ന CUSATലെ സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് മാനേജ്മെന്റ് സ്റ്റഡീസിൽ ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ ഡയറക്ടർ ജയരാജ് സാർ, പ്രൊഫസർ ജയരാജ് സാറിനെ വളരെ സ്നേഹത്തോടു കൂടി ഈ ഇതിലേക്ക് സ്വാഗതം. ഒരു വിദ്യാർത്ഥിയായി സാറിനോടൊപ്പം ചേർന്നു, എന്നാൽ സാറിന്റെ അവസാന ശ്വാസം വരെ സാറിനോടൊപ്പം ചരിച്ച ആളുകളിൽ ഏറ്റവും പ്രധാനിയായിരിക്കും CSESന്റെ സെക്രട്ടറിയും സീനിയർ ഫെലോയുമായിട്ടുള്ള KK കൃഷ്ണകുമാർ സാർ. ഞാൻ ഈ വേദിയിലേക്ക് വളരെ സ്നേഹത്തോടു കൂടി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യും. ഈ പരിപാടിയിൽ നന്ദി രേഖപ്പെടുത്തുന്നത് ഡോക്ടർ S മുരളീധരൻ സാറാണ്. സാറ് CSESലെ വൈസ് ചെയർപേഴ്സണാണ്. അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ ഇപ്പോൾ KN സെന്ററിന്റെ ഫാക്കൽറ്റി മെമ്പർ കൂടിയായിട്ടുള്ള സാറിനെ വളരെ സ്നേഹത്തോടുകൂടി വേദിയിലേക്ക് സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. ഇവിടെ കൂടിയിട്ടുള്ള വിവിധ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റികൾ, കോളേജുകൾ, അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഗവേഷണ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങൾ എന്നിവിടെ നിന്നെല്ലാം എത്തിയിട്ടുള്ളവർ, അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ സാറിന്റെ കുടുംബാംഗങ്ങളോട് എത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്, ബന്ധുക്കൾ എത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്, സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾ എത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ പ്രഭാഷണം കേൾക്കുന്നതിനും സാറിനെ കുറിച്ച് അറിയുന്നതിനെല്ലാം വേണ്ടി ഇവിടെ എത്തിയിരിക്കുന്ന മുഴുവൻ പേരെയും ഞാൻ വ്യക്തിപരമായും അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ സംഘാടകമായിട്ടുള്ള എല്ലാ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങൾക്ക് വേണ്ടിയും ഒരിക്കൽ കൂടി സ്വാഗതം പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് നിർത്തുന്നു. നന്ദി, നമസ്കാരം.
Thank you, sir. For the smooth functioning of the ceremony, I request the audience to kindly put your mobile phones in the silent mode. Now I request Dr. P.G. Shankaran, Vice Chancellor of Cochin University of Science and Technology, for the presidential address.
Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, the chief guest of the day, Professor Michael Tarayan, Chairman KCHR, Professor Jagadhiraj, Director, School of Management Studies, Dr. Muralidharan, Vice Chairperson CSES, Krishna Kumar, Senior Fellow CSES, and other faculty members, distinguished guests, well wishes of Professor KK George, and my dear friends. This is a proud and happy moment for Cochin University of Science and Technology, and the Cochin University of Science and Technology, in particular School of Management Studies, in association with CSES and Cambridge Center of MG University, is organizing second memorial lecture as a tribute to Professor KK George. As everybody knew, Professor KK George was a faculty member of Cochin University of Science and Technology during the period 1979 to 1999, 20 years. Finally, he was retired as the Director of School of Management Studies. During his period, the School of Management Studies is one of the top B schools in South India. We always acknowledge his contributions to the School of Management Studies and Kochi University of Science and Technology in various capacities. I personally met Professor K.K. George in 1990 when he became the syndicate member of Kochi University of Science and Technology. Then the close association with K.K. George was started when I joined as a faculty member at the Department of Statistics in 1997. I don't want to elaborate his contributions and his achievements because a very good elaborative account of achievements is already given in the brochure. One thing, we welcome Professor Michael Taragan to this function. After his retirement, Professor K.K. George initiated to establish a center, CSES, and he was the founder chairman of the CSES. I have been associating with the CSES since its inception. His dedication, hard work and commitment were commendable. I hope that this program will be a motivation for youngsters who are working in the area of Kerala studies, development economics, etc. I congratulate the organizers for arranging this program, and the main speaker of the program is Prof. C.P. Chandrasekhar. This is a rare opportunity for all the young people. I request all the young people to explore this rare opportunity. I wish the very best to the program. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor K.K. George's life and work has been very inspiring and worth celebrating. His contribution to the field of economics is exemplary. School of Management Studies was fortunate enough to have a visionary like Professor K.K. George as one of the former directors. Now, I would like to call upon Professor Jagadhiraj VP, current director of SMS, to reminisce about his former teacher and mentor.
Good morning, Anandal. ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ പി ജി ശങ്കരൻ സാർ, ഇന്നത്തെ വിശിഷ്ട വ്യക്തിയാൻ പ്രൊഫസർ CP Chandrasekhar സാർ, റെസ്പെക്ടഡ് ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട പ്രൊഫസർ മൈക്കിൾ തരകൻ, ബിപിൻ തമ്പി, and Dr. S. Muralidharan, my dear faculty members, today's guests, invited guests, the family members, and my dear students. ഞാനിന്ന് നിങ്ങളുടെ മുന്നിൽ നിൽക്കുന്ന വളരെ അഭിമാനത്തോടും അതിലേറെ സങ്കടത്തോടും കൂടിയാണ് നിൽക്കുന്നത്. അഭിമാനത്തോട് എന്ന് പറയാൻ കാരണം, സാറിനെ പോലുള്ള ഒരു ലെജൻഡിൻ്റെ സ്റ്റുഡൻ്റായിട്ട് ഇരിക്കാൻ എനിക്ക് സാധിച്ചിട്ട് ഞാൻ MBAക്ക് പഠിപ്പിക്കുമ്പോൾ സാർ എന്നെ പഠിപ്പിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. രണ്ടാമത് സങ്കടമെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് സാറിൻ്റെ പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കാത്തുള്ള മരണം നമ്മൾ ഒരുപാട് ദുഃഖത്തിലാക്കിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. സാറ് ജീവിച്ചിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ ഒരുപാട് കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷൻസ് നമ്മുടെ സൊസൈറ്റിക്കും കേരളത്തിലും ഉണ്ടേനെ. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞത്, ഇത് നിൽക്കുന്ന അഭിമാനത്തോടെയും അതിലേറെ ദുഃഖത്തോടെയുമാണ് നിൽക്കുന്നത്. നമ്മുടെ ടീച്ചിങ് ഫീൽഡ്, ടീച്ചിങ് കരിയറിൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സ്റ്റുഡൻറ് കരിയറിൽ നമ്മൾ ഒരുപാട് ടീച്ചേഴ്സിനെ നമ്മൾ പരിചയപ്പെടും. നമ്മൾ ഒരുപാട് ടീച്ചേഴ്സ് പഠിപ്പിക്കുകയും ചെയ്യും. പക്ഷെ പല ടീച്ചേഴ്സും പഠിപ്പിക്കുന്ന അവർ പഠിച്ചപ്പോൾ ഉള്ളത് റീപ്രൊഡ്യൂസ് ചെയ്യുക, നമുക്കത് പരീക്ഷ എഴുതി കഴിയുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് അതിനെ പിന്നെ നമ്മുടെ തലയിലും കാണത്തില്ല, നമ്മൾ മറന്നു പോകും. അതേസമയം ചില ടീച്ചേഴ്സുണ്ട് നമുക്ക് അറിവ് പകർന്നു തരുന്നത്, അത് നമ്മുടെ ജീവിതകാലം മൊത്തം ആ അറിവ് നമ്മുടെ മെമ്മറിയിൽ നിൽക്കും. അങ്ങനെ ഉള്ള ഒരു സാറാണ് KK ജോർജ്. അത് അങ്ങനെയുള്ള കുറേ സാറന്മാരുടെ ജീവിതത്തിലുണ്ടായാലും ഏറ്റവും പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട ഒരു സാറാണ് KK ജോർജ് സാർ. അപ്പോൾ സാർ അന്ന് പഠിപ്പിച്ച പല കാര്യങ്ങളും ഇത്രയും വർഷമായി, ഏതാണ്ട് 40 years ആയിട്ടുണ്ട്, ഇപ്പോഴും നമ്മുടെ സാറുമാരിലുണ്ട്. അത് ചില സാറുമാർക്ക് അങ്ങനെയുള്ള കഴിവുള്ളൂ. എല്ലാവരും പഠിപ്പിക്കും, പക്ഷെ ഇതുപോലെ ഉള്ള അറിവ് പകർന്നു പോകാൻ കഴിവുള്ള വളരെ കുറച്ച് അധ്യാപകരെ നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിലുള്ളൂ. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞ സാറിൻ്റെ ഒരു സ്റ്റുഡൻ്റാണ് ഇപ്പോഴും ഞാൻ അഭിമാനിക്കുന്നത്. കൂടാതെ സാർ ഒരുപാട് എല്ലാവരും കൂടുതൽ കാര്യങ്ങൾ ബാക്കിയുള്ള പ്രസംഗത്തിൽ പറയും. കൂടാതെ ഒരുപാട് കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷൻസ് നമ്മുടെ സൊസൈറ്റിക്കും കേരളത്തിലും ഡെവലപ്മെൻറ്റ് സാറിൻ്റെ കേരള മോഡൽ എല്ലാവരും കേട്ട് കാണും. കൂടാതെ സാറിൻ്റെ കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ പബ്ലിക് ഫിനാൻസ് ആൻഡ് വെൽഫെയർ ആക്ടിവിറ്റീസ് ഒരുപാട് സാറ് കോൺട്രിബ്യൂട്ട് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട് ഫോർ ദ സൊസൈറ്റി ഡെവലപ്മെൻറ്റ്. പിന്നെ സാറ് ഡെവലപ്മെൻറ്റ് എക്സ്പേർട്ടിൽ സാറിനെ പോലെ ഒരു എക്സ്പേർട്ട് വളരെ 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 കുറവ് ആൾക്കാരാണ് നമ്മുടെ ഈവൻ ഇൻ കൺട്രിയിലുള്ള. അതാണ് ഒരുപാട് കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷൻസ് സാറ് ചെയ്ത്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞ സങ്കടം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ സാറ് ജീവിച്ചിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ ഇതിൽ കൂടുതൽ നമുക്ക് ഒരുപാട് കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷൻ സാറ് നമുക്ക് തന്നേനെ. പിന്നെ എനിക്ക് ജീവിതത്തിൽ മറക്കാൻ പറ്റാത്ത ഒരു കടപ്പാടും കൂടെ സാറിനോട്ടുണ്ട്. ഞാനിന്നിവിടെ SMS ഡയറക്ടറായിട്ട് ഇരുന്ന് നിങ്ങളുടെ മുന്നിൽ ഇങ്ങനെ ഇരിക്കാൻ സാറ് ഒരു നിമിത്തമായിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതായത് ഡയറക്ടർ ആവുന്ന സമയത്ത് കുറച്ച് ചെറിയ പ്രശ്നങ്ങളുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഇപ്പം ഞാൻ സാറിനെ വിളിച്ചൊരു സഹായം പറ്റും, സാർ ഇങ്ങനെ ഉണ്ട്. അന്ന് സാറിന് സുഖമില്ലാതിരുന്നിട്ടും സാറ് പല സിൻഡിക്കേറ്റ് മെമ്പേഴ്സിനെയൊക്കെ വിളിച്ചു പറഞ്ഞ് എനിക്ക് സഹായം ചെയ്തു തന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് എനിക്കിന്ന് ഡയറക്ടറായിട്ട് SMS ഈ ചെയറിലിരിക്കാൻ പറ്റുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് ഒരിക്കലും എനിക്ക് സാറിൻ്റെ മറക്കാൻ പറ്റാത്ത ഒരു കടപ്പാട് എൻ്റെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ മരിക്കുന്നവരെ എനിക്ക് സാറിനോടുണ്ട്. അത് ഈ അവസരത്തിൽ ഞാനത് പറഞ്ഞില്ലെങ്കിൽ അത് സാറിനോട് ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു ഇതായിരിക്കും. കാരണം ഡയറക്ടറായിട്ട് അത് ശരിക്കും സാറിൻ്റെ ഒരു റോളുണ്ട്. എനിക്ക് ആ സമയത്ത് സാറ് വളരെ സുഖമില്ലാതിരിക്കുന്ന സമയത്ത് തന്നെ ഞാൻ ഫോണിൽ കൂടെ വിളിച്ചു പറഞ്ഞു, നേരിട്ട് കാണണം വരണ്ട, സുഖമില്ല, ഫോണിൽ കൂടെ വിളിച്ചു പറഞ്ഞപ്പോൾ സാറ് ഒരുപാട് എന്നെ സഹായിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. ആ സമയത്ത് പലരും വിളിച്ചു പറഞ്ഞ് വളരെ എനിക്ക് വേണ്ടി റെക്കമെൻഡ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. അപ്പം അതുകൊണ്ട് ഈ അവസരത്തിൽ സാറിൻ്റെ ഓർമ്മയ്ക്ക് മുമ്പിൽ എൻ്റെ പ്രണാമം അർപ്പിക്കുന്നു. സാറിൻ്റെ ആത്മാവിന് നിത്യശാന്തി നേർന്നുകൊണ്ട് നിർത്തുന്നു. നന്ദി, നമസ്കാരം.
Thank you, sir. We have actually two more people to remember the memories of Professor K.K. George, but as our speaker is having a little urgency that he has to leave early, we will be proceeding with the memorial lecture. Yes, our eminent social scientist, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar. He is with us today for the memorial lecture of Professor K.K. George for 2023. Professor Chandrasekhar currently serves as a senior research fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He was a former professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Chandrasekhar was also a visiting senior lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He is also the chair professor at Malcolm Adiseshiah K.M. Raj Studies Center, MG University. Professor Chandrasekhar was bestowed the Malcolm Adiseshiah Award in 2009 for his contributions to economics and development studies. His areas of interest include the role of finance and industry in developing countries. He has published in reputed academic journals, publications, and authored and co-authored several books. Few books amongst his publications include Crisis as Conquest, Learning from East Asia, The Market That Failed, Neoliberal Economic Reforms in India, and Demonetization Decoded, a critic of India's currency experiment. Professor Chandrasekhar is a regular economic columnist for the Frontline magazine, Business Line, The Economic and Political Weekly. He has a long list of accomplishments which I am not attempting to list here. It is indeed a great honor to have you here with us, sir. Let me now invite Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar to deliver the lecture on the topic, Can the Center Hold? Engineered Inequality and India's Development Trajectory. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Professor Shankaran, distinguished guests on the dais, including my close friend Michael Tarakan. We worked together for a few years. Other senior faculty members and ladies and gentlemen, other students. It's of course for me a privilege to have been invited to deliver this second memorial lecture for Professor K.K. George. I was fortunate enough to be at the Center for Development Studies when he had decided to take off from his life as a professional finance person and come to do his PhD with Professor Gulati at that point of time. And there have been many days when behind the charming smile with a drooping cigarette, we've had many an argument which I wouldn't forget, and therefore I do, besides the immense respect one has for the work he has done over the years, I do deem it a privilege to have been invited. Thank you very much. I have given a topic to this lecture. Can I just use this? Yeah, what is that? Yeah. This is just, you don't have to bother too much about that. It's notes for my own use rather than for... Yeah. So, the subject I've chosen is a bit of an elaborate subject, but I would be looking at certain aspects of this, which is to really ask the question, taking off from the kind of issues which K.K. George and Professor George and others, particularly him and Professor Gulati, virtually set the agenda to an understanding of the way in which center-state fiscal relations or center-state economic relations in general had evolved and were going to evolve over the years in the Indian context. And it was a context, of course, which was remarkable. It was remarkable not merely because of the Constitution of India as a union of states, but it was remarkable because of the fact that here was a country which at that point of time, when we gained independence, had an extremely low level of per capita income, was geographically, of course, huge, with a large population, very diverse in character, divided in many senses because of caste and other factors. And in such a country, we chose at that point of time to launch on development within the framework of parliamentary democracy with one vote for every citizen. And that was actually a remarkable phenomenon in an ex-colonial and an underdeveloped country at that point of time. And therefore, India's development experiment within this framework of parliamentary democracy attracted worldwide attention. Some of the leading economists in the world, some from the left, like Maurice Dobb, Rosenstein Rodan, Ragnar Fish, you name it, all the top economists in some sense came to look at or to examine the Indian experience and write about it and make their own suggestions because of the fact of the remarkable nature of this experiment. And one remarkable aspect of that was to a certain extent the effort to try and develop meticulously a framework in which what was a union of state could stay together, that in some sense, how exactly do you ensure in this quasi-federal framework in which you would be able to ensure development of the country as a whole, as a nation, because that was a period of a real nation-building exercise, but to do it in a fashion in which both the center and the union can hold. And crucial to that, of course, was the decision to actually say that given the asymmetry between the ability as Professor Gulati, Professor George and many others subsequently based on their work have shown us, that taking into account the fact that there is a significant asymmetry between the ability of states to mobilize resources through taxation efficiently and their responsibilities, their development responsibilities because of being provincial governments which within the framework in which you respected the subsidiarity principle, had to undertake a lot of the developmental responsibilities and therefore had to undertake a lot of the development expenditures which were needed. That in order to correct for this asymmetry, it was decided that there should be a framework of devolution of resources, and this was supposed to be done in a way which would be both vertically and horizontally fair, for which it was decided that we should constitute every 5 years, the nation should constitute every 5 years, an independent, and that's very important, an independent finance commission, which will then draw up the principles both for sharing in vertical sense of the devolution of resources and some principles for the sharing of resources between the states, such that pre-existing regional inequalities don't get aggravated over a period of time. Now, I really wanted to turn to this, not to really ask the question whether the Constitution has been respected or not from the point of view of this principle of the devolution of resources, because as I said, much work has been done on this. But I want to place this in a context which has become important today because of the fact that we know that in many senses at the political level there are huge, and at the political level as opposed to the economic level, there are huge challenges to this quasi-federal system with a tendency towards centralization of a kind, which of course people have tried to capture by saying that, you know, we got into a situation where we need one tax, we need one language, we need, most recently, we need one election if we are one nation. And for example, the Tamil Nadu Chief Minister has said that this is a blatant attack on the federal structure of the country. So that what we've had is really in recent times a significant degree of attention of a kind which hadn't been paid adequately in the past, excepting for instances when there was a particularly intense conflict between a specific state and the center or the center's representative in the form of the governor. But this has become now a routine issue in state after state where opposition parties rule. This has become a routine issue. So we have a political challenge, and there is a tendency to say that, listen, I mean, you know, because of the fact that the degree of effort and attention which had been paid to understanding the complexity of center-state economic and fiscal relations and their evolution over a period of time, the same degree of attention was for some reason, because it wasn't as consistent a phenomenon over time, was paid to the political challenge in the form of centralization which would occur and the link between the two. And this, in fact, I mean, this morning I noticed that the most recent issue of the London Economist, for example, has written about federalism in India and tries to make the point that, you know, having a degree of integration or a degree of uniformity or a degree of centralization, which is what it essentially is and not really integration, in the economic sphere is a good thing. And obviously, the argument which the London Economist gives is that it's a good thing because of the fact that that creates a national market, which is of course in the interests of global capital. But on the other hand, they say that it may not be such a good thing not to have to have centralization at a political level, and therefore they refer to these tendencies which I've just mentioned, in particular to the one nation, one election call or the constitution of a panel to examine this issue, as saying that this may not be the right step. Of course, even that, while they say that a certain degree of centralization even at the political level might not be all that bad, but the specific form it is taking is not very good. So this reflects, I think, a longer-term tendency to make this distinction between political centralization and economic centralization, where a lot of people said that, listen, I mean, you know, over a period of time, economic centralization has become necessary. There are problems at the state level in terms of the wastage of resources, in terms of the populism of governments which get elected there. And that therefore, and of course the need for a certain degree of uniformity in taxation. So even now, right from the time it was introduced, the GST, the goods and services tax, which is actually a value-added tax, which is actually regressive in many ways, was seen as a game changer, that this is going to be something which will integrate and therefore is a game changer from the point of view of development. But on the other hand, it was said that politically, you know, there
this is not really linked to what happens in the political sphere, which is why we haven't seen the same tendency. But what we are seeing now is an acceleration of this tendency. Now, and underlying all of this, of course, is something which we need to possibly integrate into our understanding of what centralization does, and in part, from where does this centralization emerge, and therefore deliver what seems to be this outcome. And that outcome is the extreme increases in inequality, which we've seen in the Indian context in recent years. These numbers have been quoted so regularly that we're all quite familiar with them. In particular, the work of Piketty and Chancel, because the problem is that we don't have data of a kind which can be used to assess income inequality, excepting to a certain extent the IHDS, but otherwise the consumption surveys miss out on the upper income deciles of the population, or the upper income consumption deciles. And therefore that they're good for estimating poverty, but they're not particularly good for estimating inequality. So we've had very stray estimates of inequality, many of them actually to do with local level surveys, repeat surveys in villages and so on, of trying to understand what's happened to inequality. So when Piketty and Chancel, using tax data for a long period of time, made this analysis, despite the criticism which has been made from some quarters, this has actually been quoted quite often, and that points to, there are two things which have come out of those. One, of course, is that there is this extreme inequality in the country, but more important, what Piketty and Chancel pointed to was the fact that this inequality really was getting corrected to a certain extent, and that correction ended, and therefore we saw a return to an inequalizing path of development in the period after the coming of neoliberalism, the embrace of neoliberalism in 1991 by the government of India in the wake of, then government of India, in the wake of the balance of payments crisis that we experienced in July 1991. Now, along with that, besides this inequality, and as I said, in inequality which is increasing, there's also been work which points to, these are the trends over time, which points to extreme wealth inequality. And this extreme wealth inequality, which of course partly came out of work which is done at the World Institute of Development Economic Research, but subsequently has been taken over by Credit Suisse and by Oxfam and others, points to once again an extremely high level of inequality of wealth, but also an inequality of wealth which, as in the case of income, seems to be increasing in the more recent period. And the most recent of the Oxfam reports, of course, points to the fact that 40% of the wealth created in the country between, over the decade sort of ending 2021, had gone to just 1% of the population. And only about 3% went to the bottom 50%, and it pointed in particular to the billionaire phenomenon. The fact that India suddenly started generating on a routine basis newer billionaires, and everybody of course speaks of one of them who in a very short period of time became the richest in India, in Asia, etc., which is of course Mr. Gautam Adani. So we have these three things. One is we have this long-term tendency of a sort of erosion of the sort of the ability to be able to ensure a degree of vertical and horizontal equality in center-state relations, fiscal relations in particular, and we have the centralization of the political centralization, of which we had, of course, some experiences over time, some tendencies over time, prior to this decade, to the most recent decade, and of course we had the period of the emergency, which of course was characterized by a high degree of centralization in political decision making, but all said and done, there is evidence to suggest, or there is, our experience does seem to suggest, that there's been a substantial increase in this political centralization. And the third, as I said, is this extreme inequality, which is also tending to accelerate in the most recent period. Now, the reason this inequality also matters is because of the fact that it's not that we didn't have inequality and also a tendency for inequality to increase to the extent that we have evidence to be able to examine this. In the past, in fact, the thing about the late 1950s and early 1960s, going up to about 1966, was the extreme concern within the government of India about inequality in the country. In fact, there were a large number of official reports, official committees, which were set up to investigate inequalities of various kinds. So we had the Monopolies Inquiry Commission report, which was very concerned about the increasing concentration in a few big business houses of corporate assets, of assets outside the financial sector. And then we had the Dutt Committee report, the Industrial Licensing Policy Inquiry Committee report, which also looked at industrial concentration, but more importantly, went on to suggest that state policy at that point of time, including policies meant to curb increases in asset inequality, like licensing, etc., and of course the provision of credit by the banking system, was actually worsening inequality in terms of asset inequality within the corporate sector. And finally, we also had the Mahalanobis Committee on income distribution and levels of living and standards of living in India, which also came in the mid-1960s. So the point was, at that point of time, while there were some signs that inequality was increasing, there was a concern about this inequality and a concern within the state. I mean, it was not a concern just of the public at large. Whereas what we have now is not merely an absence of much attention, even though the evidence is very clear that there's a steep increase in inequality which is occurring over the last decade, but also obviously a belief that this is an inevitability of some kind of a growth process which will accelerate the rate of growth of GDP, independent of the fact that the GDP is being distributed in a fashion in which a large part of the population is left out of the trajectory of development. Now, so it's in that context that I just want to briefly go back to looking at the way in which the analysis conducted by people like Professor K.K. George helped us to understand what were the mechanisms through which we were beginning to see a degree of centralization and therefore an increase in vertical inequality within the center-state framework, within the framework of India being a union of states. Okay. Well, there were a number of factors, some of which were pointed out by some of them, all of them. Some of them were pointed out by particular analysts. But I'm just summarizing some of these. One, of course, is the available evidence suggested to start with that the finance commissions, which were supposed to be independent, it became clear over a period of time, particularly, of course, after the 11th Finance Commission and so on, it became very clear we're not independent institutions, and this was to a certain extent understandable because of the fact that the Constitution did not provide for a check and balance which would prevent the Finance Commission, which is in essence constituted by the center, very often manned by people who have served the government in the past, that they tend to constitute this, and they not only tended to constitute this and the terms of reference of these committees, but they did it in a fashion in which over a period of time there was less and less consultation with the states. And it became clear at some point of time why there was less consultation with the states, because of the fact that the Finance Commission's TOR, so terms of reference, became mechanisms through which the center was required or allowed to impose discipline on the states, either directly through fiscal transfers or indirectly through the operations of the Reserve Bank of India in terms of its control over the ability of these governments to be able to borrow from the market. Okay. Second was that, of course, we know that a large chunk of these resources were kept out of the Finance Commission's ambit. So you basically tried to shrink the sort of universe of the Finance Commission, and obviously that resulted in discrimination because of the fact that decision making with respect to this was with central agencies, and this kind of a tendency got aggravated once you had the abolition of the Planning Commission and the and the National Development Council, which at least provided for a semblance of consultation with the states to take into account the views of the states, and the view of the state has always been that they are being provided with an unfair share as far as the distribution of resources between the center and the states is concerned. The third, which was pointed out, was that, you began to rely, over time on taxes which you didn't need to share with the center. So it is not that you moved things out of the ambit of the Finance Commission, but within the ambit of the Finance Commission, you moved your resources out of a set of imposts which actually were not shareable. And of course, the classic case of this was the CSES and surcharges, which we now, as everybody has been pointing out, have become a significant share of the total resources being generated by the center, and does not fall within the divisible pool of resources which is subject to Finance Commission, even if not independent Finance Commission order. And then there was the whole question that states were, because you cannot not blame the states in this, states were in some sense persuaded to accept the goods and services tax. And you were persuaded to accept the goods and services tax because of the fact that there was a whole ideological sort of stance adopted by the dominant economic opinion within the state and outside the state, which made a number of points. First, of course, it suggested that a goods and services tax is going to be more efficient. It's not only efficient, it would actually, do away with the cascading impact of other kinds of indirect taxes. It would not only do away with all of this, it would result in it was argued, because of the efficiency with which it can be imposed and taxes collected, it would result in a significant increase in the revenues which would accrue to the states. And to persuade them that this is what is going to happen, the center held out the carrot that for a period of 5 years they would be compensated for any shortfall of revenues relative to a trajectory in which they were going to get a 14% increase in revenues. And willy-nilly, all states finally, some humming and hawing, but finally came together and accepted this. In fact, some states thought, I believe Kerala, for example, thought that because it is a consuming state, it would actually be a significant beneficiary of the goods and services tax. Now, we know that for a long period of time, the evidence was very clear. The states had got hit very badly by the goods and services tax in two ways. First, of course, that they had ceded their right to tax across a large spectrum, other than for alcohol and petrol and so on. They actually ceded their right to taxation, which is actually giving up their power to be able to create for themselves a certain degree of local policy space by generating their own revenues. But more importantly, not only did they cede, it became clear that they were not getting anywhere near what was being promised in terms of increases in revenues. Okay? In fact, there was no reason to believe that if you take the normal pace of growth and if you take the rate of inflation, they were now in nominal terms getting anywhere near what they would possibly have got even under the earlier regime. Now this finally is, of course, getting completely shrouded over and concealed by the fact that we are constantly talking about, has the level of GST gone up? In August, GST relative to the August of the previous year is so many percent higher. Now, that's not what you should be doing. What you should be doing is drawing a line which actually shows the trajectory of a 14% increase in GST revenue and say, where are we? Are we at that? Are we above that trajectory? Are we below that trajectory? And I think everybody who has tried to draw that line has actually found that if you generate a trajectory of a 14% increase in revenues, you are well short of that trajectory, and therefore you not only ceded your right to taxation, but you also lost out in terms of the revenues that you were able to mobilize. And once the compensation ended, you actually knew that you're in a situation in which many states are really in a steep crisis. And this crisis is all the greater because of the massive attack which came through getting the states to implement the FRBM acts, which voluntarily forced them to reduce the extent of borrowing that they would undertake. And this then became a disciplining influence where both the center and the central bank together can actually prevent the states from going out and borrowing even in a situation like the COVID pandemic, where a large part of the expenditures on health had to be undertaken by state governments, you actually had a situation in which excepting for a very small fraction, any increase in borrowing from the market would actually be accompanied by conditionalities, that you must meet the following things, then you'll be allowed to borrow another 1 percentage point of your state domestic, your SDP, more than what was permitted earlier. So you put all of this together and, here the picture is very clear. Here the picture is very clear that actually it's a set of acts of commission, not omission, but it's a set of acts of commission which is generated the inequality which has precipitated what is an evolving but already quite a serious crisis in terms of the position of state finances in a number of states. Now, if we place this in the context of the other inequality that I've been talking about, we can ask the question, listen, in some sense, is this just a question of revenue sharing, or is there a larger agenda? And I think that we can possibly argue for a larger agenda which if we place it in the context of political centralization. Because what does political centralization today amount to? It really amounts to the fact that you want to create a situation in which at the state level you cannot have governments which are different from the government at the center in terms of the party which actually rules the alliance or solely rules the government. You actually want a double engine, you appeal to the people that they should actually vote for a double engine sarkar. Now what does a double engine sarkar mean? It basically means that if you want to get the benefits of development which the state is supposed to provide, then you cannot get it if you don't elect a government which also rules at the center, which essentially is saying that politically you want to create a situation in which you do not respect the notion that there has to be a certain degree of variety, of diversity in the political mosaic which constitutes the Union of States that is India. Now when we look at this aspect of it, one of the things which emerges is that to partly ensure this, what do? You try and put a squeeze. You try and put a squeeze on the ability of state governments to undertake a set of policies which will bring the party, whichever be the party in power in that state, will bring that party of power a certain degree of political legitimacy. And in this, two things are quite crucial. A certain amount of capital expenditure undertaken at the state level, which is not purely a central scheme or central project, and a certain amount of provision of spending on welfare in the form of course, food and ensuring, some degree of guaranteed employment, which started in Maharashtra. Let us not forget, it didn't start at the national level. So you basically need a certain amount of spending in terms of capital spending as well as spending on welfare measures. And what you're trying to do is actually create a situation in which you're reducing the resources of states to basically meeting the legacy expenditures that they have built. If you have hired people in the past, you got their salaries and pensions to be paid. If you have borrowed in the past, you have interest rates, interest to be paid, because that is a commitment. And if you end up with a situation that at the end of it you do not have any resources left, you cannot, of course, firstly to start with, undertake capital expenditure, which gets cut out, and then of course you cannot undertake welfare expenditures. And even to the extent that states somehow use every penny that they can get and borrow to undertake welfare expenditures, this is dismissed as being in the nature of whatever they call it, reverie or something like that. That is, that these are basically subsidies which are being handed over for political purposes. This is populism of a certain kind. Now, if therefore what we have is that we are ending up where at the state level, to the extent that there is any developmental expenditure which is being undertaken, even to the extent that the expenditure is shared by the state, these are increasingly branded as central schemes, and not merely central schemes, basically the highest authority. Every scheme is a prime minister something, so you basically say that all expenditures are central, so that you want to actually squeeze the expenditures which can be undertaken, and the sort of the sort of credit for that expenditure devolve on the state or the party which is ruling the state to give it a certain degree of political legitimacy. That is in some sense what he wanted to do. So if looking back now, this was not just a process of the erosion of a principle of sharing of resources. This was actually a process of ensuring political centralization, that you actually wanted to get to a situation where you can in some sense ensure that one of the principal ways in which a government can win itself legitimacy gets eroded because of the fact that it doesn't have access to the resources to be able to win that legacy. Now, does this mean that this principle that you shouldn't have populist expenditures operates for everybody? Of course not. We know that there are huge amounts of populist, schemes, if you want to call it that. I don't think they're a bad thing at all. But so-called populist schemes adopted by the center, adopted by governments in the states which are ruled by parties which are similar to those which rule at the center. So there's no question that, these expenditures are being undertaken in substantial measure. But more important than that, what we begin to see, and that I think that's the last point, that in some sense that some of these expenditures now are actually, or absence of resource mobilization are actually measures by which you create the income and asset inequality that we observe. And I just want to take a simple example, which is the sort of decision which we've seen in recent times to actually generate, the realization that over a long period of time, economic growth in India, to the extent that you can call it growth, because of the fact that GDP suggests that your total income has been increasing, has come from services. Something like 2/3 of the incremental income increase in GDP has come from services. So you basically now once again have to go back to a whole scheme that you had as the major plank of your national policy, which is to try and have some degree of diversification towards manufacturing. And you want this diversification towards manufacturing, first in the form of the Make in India schemes, and subsequently in the form of production in India of a substantial amount of manufacturing goods, particularly in high-tech areas. Now, how is that sought to be ensured in recent policy? What is Make in India? It basically is now hinging on one particular scheme, which is the production-linked incentive scheme. What is the production-linked incentive scheme? It basically says that if you meet certain criteria with regard to additional investment, the incremental income relative to a base year between around 2006, the incremental income up to between 4 and 6% of that will be provided to you as an incentive payment. That is business. And when we talk about these businesses, which are talking about 14 major industries for which something like 2 lakh crores in the first instance have been allotted as the basis for the subsidy. So you're actually going to subsidize big business, relatively big business. There's constant talk about how much has gone also to the medium and small scale industries, but basically this goes to large players. Now, this of course, just as much as when you provide all sorts of exemptions of tax, which is described in the budget documents as expenditures, tax expenditures. They are not described as subsidies, they are described as tax expenditures. Similarly, these are not treated as freebies. Basically, what are you saying? You're undertaking production, which you anyway possibly would have undertaken, but if you actually undertake it and increase your production over a period of time, we will give you a cash incentive. Now, if you get a 6% cash incentive, that's like adding 6% of incremental sales to your profit, which is actually a big incentive to provide. Who does this incentive go? So if you take one stream, which is information technology, where this has attracted a lot of attention, which are the government itself has said there are 38 companies. This includes global ones like HP, Dell, Lenovo, Foxconn, and they proposed increments of over $40 billion, rupees of additional production. So they're going to get something like 6% of this 3.35 trillion that they're going to generate. Now, the point is, this response of these 38 companies is seen as very welcome because of the fact that when the PLI was first launched in this area, there were only 14 applicants who received approval, and only 2, which is Dell and Micromax, met the targets for 2021-22, which is the first year. Why wasn't it working? It wasn't working because when the scheme started for IT hardware, the subsidy provided was only 2%. And they were not happy with 2%. The moment you hike the subsidy and pushed it to the 4 to 6% range, you're ending up with a situation where there is a significant response. So you're basically saying that, listen, you come and invest and we will give you a subsidy to produce additionally more. And what do you combine it with? Of course, it's currently on hold, but you combine it with this, with a policy in which you're saying, oh, even this doesn't seem to be working enough. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to prevent imports of a set of products which should be produced domestically. So we suddenly overnight, I'm not against protection, but suddenly overnight we reduced to put under licensing imports of laptops and servers and hardware of that kind, which means what? Which means you come and invest and whatever you produce will be protected from foreign competition in significant measure because you need a license to import. And operating for this protected market, if you increase your output, up to 6% of your incremental sales will be given to you as a cash subsidy. Now this is an extreme example. I mean, we can, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. This is an extreme example of how state policy is used to engineer a redistribution of income and therefore of wealth in favor of whom? In favor of the big business groups. Does this help actually make in India? Well, Raghuram Rajan, who by no means is a radical, was the governor of the Reserve Bank, professor in a management school, basically said that, listen, they're going to encourage screwdriver technology because what they'll do is they'll just import all of they can't import PCs, but they'll import all the components, come here and assemble PCs, increase production, which they can sell very easily at relatively high prices, and in addition to that, we'll give them 6% of their incremental value. So you can actually see that how there is a tendency to engineer this redistribution. Now, it is as a result of the adoption in multiple ways in recent times, the provision of land, the provision of subsidies of various kinds. In fact, if you take the semiconductor case, of course, these are allegations, this is what's reported in the press, but Micron Technology is going to make an investment in Gujarat, and supposedly the central government would cover up to something like 50% of the total project cost in one form or the other, and state government another 20%. You don't even have to invest. You basically have to say that I'll come there, I'll put my name to it, put a little bit of money, and I will produce for a market which hopefully you will protect for me. So that is really the extreme example of the way in which you engineer inequality, which creates the asset and income inequality of the kind that we see. Now, what is the problem with this? Of this kind of a tendency is, of course, the problem with this kind of a tendency is that it does away with any countervailing power, because finally the only countervailing power against corporate power, as Galbraith had pointed out a long while back, is the state. I mean, you can have a certain degree of action by civil society, but finally, unless the state takes action against the countervailing power, which is why we had the Monopolies and Restricted Practices Act come in the mid-60s after all those reports which I had just mentioned, or we saw the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act coming in. It was in some sense the state saying that, okay, we have to act as a countervailing power to prevent excessive concentration, because if you don't, over a period of time, you not only will have this concentration of wealth, you not only have capture of state policy in a number of areas, you basically will have a process in which whatever you do, I mean, you can have liberalization which is supposed to encourage competition. Take civil aviation, they're going to be very soon reduced to 2 or 3 airlines at most. Take telecommunications, you're going to have 2 major players in the cell phone business. You liberalize in order to create a competitive framework. So you're ending up creating this kind of a concentration, and if you have concentration of this kind, at some point of time it begins to influence the media, and if it begins to influence the media, and other activities, it undermines completely the ability of civil society to in some way serve as a countervailing power to corporate influence. But really, if we say that there is no countervailing power because of the fact that the state is not serving as countervailing power, what are we in essence saying? We are saying that there is a compact. There is a compact between the state and big business, and if there is a compact between state and big business, it is actually no more a capture of policy, but it's a way in which economic and political centralization come together to constitute a state whose implications for democracy is not really the kind of implications which are implicit in an erosion of the principles of the division of resources between the center and the states, but it has implications far more for the ability to generate a democratic process of development. Now, I want to conclude by saying that what is going to be, if you try to imagine the outcome of this, the outcome of this finally is going to be that this compact is going to allow for a rise in the share of surplus in national income over a period of time. It's already happening, but this is going to continue. Now, if you actually have an increase in the share of surplus in national income over a long period of time, you're completely demolishing the market for mass manufacturers. You're demolishing the mass market in the country. And if you demolish that, you really are demolishing the basis on which even the center can try and act as an agent to generate growth ostensibly led and delivered for the people by one particular party which rules in the center. That is, what is unclear in all of this is that why the message that if you do this, if you have this kind of a centralization in terms of fiscal and economic relations between the center and the states, an increasing concentration of capital, a rise in income and wealth inequality, you're finally going to undermine the pace of expansion of the market and therefore the pace of growth of the system, which will essentially mean that you might be eroding, damaging, God knows, hopefully not, destroying the quasi-federal structure that the Constitution sought to build, but you could actually be completely undermining the possibilities of growth, which is why I asked the question, can the center hold? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now the floor is actually open for a question and answer session. So because of the paucity of the time, we can take up to 2 or 3 questions maximum.
No, I've still got 45 minutes to an hour, so I think we should have the others speak if you don't mind. I can answer the questions after that, is that okay?
Yeah. Sure, sir.
I don't know, I don't want to disturb your program, but I'm just...
No problem, sir.
Maybe Michael and Tom, why don't you speak?
Will we have the question and answer session after this?
So first of all, I would like to thank you for the valuable insights you have thrown on how the engineered inequality has been happening and how the redistribution of resources which is favorable to a particular target group. But as with along with the discussions what we have carried out here, the real challenge is the data paucity because we don't have an updated census and data on inequality, because when we look at Adiseshiah survey also, the latest one is only till 2015, and we are still relying on inequality for consumption expenditure of various NSSR surveys. So how do we prioritize, or actually how do we give priorities to the income inequality? What are kind of inequality measures without this kind of valuable data? So that is kind of throwing a real challenge for inequality trajectory of the country. Along with all these discussions what we had on the redistribution of resources to a particular target group. So So what actually concerns an academician or a researcher is that how do we actually write about it and discuss about it with proper data available in the public domain? So how should we go about it?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. But, let's put it this way. If you have a country as large as we have and a population of the size that we have, it is impossible to actually be able on a private basis, and a private basis which also is not influenced, because finally if you have private corporates collecting data, because they collect the data to sell the data, which we know there are many companies which do this, then obviously there are a whole set of questions which can arise about transparency, about the extent of coverage, because they'll try to save money, about the way in which the surveys are conducted, etc. So it's unavoidable, as we had recognized very early in a country like ours, many countries, in fact most countries, that unless there is a state agency which takes on this responsibility, it's very difficult to generate the data of a degree of quality and coverage which is needed to answer the kind of questions that you're raising about inequality, etc. And that's what Mahalanobis tried to do. That was what the whole Indian statistical system was, and it was an excellent statistical system. We know that first it got eroded because of the fact that the money which was allotted to these agencies got shrunk, they had to contract things out, etc. And now we know that it's because of the fact that you don't have the data. So if you get a set of consumption expenditure survey which doesn't yield for you results which is in keeping with what you think is what should be reflected, then you dump that consumption expenditure survey in saying that it's flawed. And if the ostensible collector of the data says that the data is flawed, obviously we have a problem, because who is to actually say, no, that's not flawed, because the agency which is collecting it is actually saying it's flawed. But this doesn't stop there. Then you don't want a census for multiple reasons, and you decide not to have a census. Then you have somebody who is actually just managing a process which is a statistical process and collecting data, but you don't like the results which are coming out of it in the family health survey, so you get after people who are not even responsible for the results which are being generated. This because you don't like the data. So we are trapped between the fact that we need the state to generate data of a kind which would be adequate in terms of quality and coverage, but we then need a state which actually allows for a certain degree of independence in the conducting of these surveys and in the collection and collation of this data, which unfortunately we don't have. So what are we reduced to? We are reduced to people who are undertaking smaller surveys, village surveys and all, which is what non-profit academics, researchers, etc. can do, as opposed to a corporate which decides to become a data collecting agency. We have to piece together those kinds of things to try and build a story, but the story can never be as good as if we had an appropriate statistical agency. That's part of this whole agenda.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself, Arvind Krishnan from C College. Sir, when you told about this inequality in income distribution, can India achieve fairness in distribution? Because my thought. Hello. Hello. Okay. When you speak about this this inequality in wealth distribution, can India achieve an equality in fairness for distribution at any point of time? Because this inequality is becoming as an equilibrium. That is, when the rich are getting rich, the poor is still poor. It is a condition of equilibrium. So can you break this inequality in any point of time?
Yeah, I suppose at least, I think that's why we are economists and we are social scientists and we are citizens, because we believe that we can have a fairer world. The thing is, of course, I see your point, but there's different elements to it. One, of course, is that so long as asset inequality exists, income inequality is going to be there, and that would actually have a cumulative effect. But the problem with what we have is that asset inequality not only has not been undermined, as was promised in the early years after independence. I mean, that is part of the whole Nehru-Malinowitz agenda of trying to reduce that inequality through direct action. But the other is, of course, is that a major agency for redistribution in market economies is the state. That using multiple means, but particularly using your right to tax and decide the kind of pattern and structure of taxation, as well as deciding on how to use this tax in terms of expenditures, both through your tax structure and through your expenditures composition, you try and actually have a redistributive influence, not only a growth-inducing influence, but also a redistributive influence. Now, what I was trying to suggest is that has got inverted. So it's not only that you're not dealing with prevailing asset inequality and therefore the income inequality which flows from it, you're worsening that because of the fact that the state engineers a redistribution of income from the bottom to the top. And that can be prevented if you have a different state. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Sir, in 2015, the Planning Commission of India was where the Niti Aayog was started. So, the Niti So Niti Aayog started with an objective of cooperative federalism, that is to improve the healthy competition between the central and state as well as between the states. So according to you, do you think that the term cooperative federalism, the objective, has the Niti Aayog achieved it? Because previously when planning commission was there, the role of states were limited or to none. There was no role of state. But whereas the Niti Aayog is claiming that there is cooperative federalism, the role of states has improved. What do you think, the term cooperative federalism has been achieved or not?
I would disagree with you on, there's a difference between what the Planning Commission was envisaged to do as an institution and what it ended up doing in practice, okay? Because the original intent of the Planning Commission combined with the National Development Council was, the intent was actually to create a situation in which the voice of the states would be heard at the central level, and resources which are not being transferred or devolved through the Finance Commission process would actually be allocated across states in ways in which you would help state development, but more importantly, you would help a certain degree of horizontal inequality between states. That is, states which are already developed, regional inequalities which already exist wouldn't get worsened over a period of time. So the whole idea was that was supposed to be an instrument, that the two together, the Planning Commission, and which not only planned, which of course was supposed to be a redistributive exercise, but actually did it in a fashion in which the states would have a voice in central planning. Finally, of course, it became a waiting room for state governments to go and sit down and decide how much you're going to get for your as planned funds. It's true, but that's because of the implementation as part of this process of centralization. The ending or the abolition of the Planning Commission and the National Development Council essentially meant that you destroyed the voice of the states. It's true, you can turn back and say the voice of the states were not being heard in any case within this framework, but the point is what you did is now you actually even undermined the agency so that you couldn't fight back to say, no, I want a greater voice in the way in which planned funds are distributed or spent. Okay, so that's the way I would look at it. That the Niti Aayog is a non-body. What does it do? It's supposed to be a think tank, but anyway you have a number of think tanks which reflect the neoliberal ideology. Why do you want one inside government, a think tank? The government doesn't need a think tank inside government. So it basically was an attempt to undermine even the institution, independent of its operation and practice, which could give the states a voice.
Thank you, sir, for your excellent lecture. And one thing I would like to just ask you is, what is your opinion regarding as to what would be the role of academics? You're telling me about the data which is being published or from the central government agencies. If you don't like the data, you just abolish the data. But when it comes to the academics or the researchers who are working in the nation, also we see that tendency of just fabricating information, or we have just been driven back to early Stone Age. Recently we had an IIT director who was telling that the natural disasters are happening just because of the reason that we are non-vegetarians. So what could be the role of the academia? Are you directed by somebody to tell something, or will we have that freedom, or how do we just direct the young generation to understand what is a fact?
Well, I retired from a university whose experience is not the best to provide you optimism on this count, but yeah, there's a difference between what neoliberalism in general, but particularly the sort of vicious kind of neoliberalism which we've seen in recent times. Among the worst things it has done to this country is to begin to destroy education. I mean, not just university education, but school education in many ways. So the point is, you need these institutions because they are the places to which people go for their education, and you find that the space you have as a free-thinking individual, as an academic, is undermined because of the way in which it is being treated, or you don't even get a foothold into that space in the case of many young people. But to the extent that you do, I suppose it still is a space in which they can't completely control everything. Once you go to the classroom, of course they still control. You can say something in the classroom which you think is perfectly okay, and tomorrow somebody would put it up on Twitter or something, or X or whatever it is, and that becomes a controversy and you get into trouble. So it can even enter the classroom. But I suppose we are in that phase of history which hopefully will pass, in which we have to try and use every little space as academics we have, independent of the effort to curb us, rather than say that because it's like this, we'll sanitize we'll pre-censor, we'll sanitize, and in any case, certain things, if you happen to be a physicist and you're doing work on experimental physics of a kind, they're not going to be able to come and tell you, no, you only do things which was done 2 centuries back or 10 centuries back or whatever it is. But they can, but in the social sciences and the humanities, it is a problem. And the only thing I can think of is that we exploit every little bit of space that we have till such time when hopefully this too shall pass. Yeah.
Hello, sir. My question is that isn't this income inequality a problem that all major economics have at some point of time have faced? I know that presently the average income distribution of India is a positively skewed graph. Positively skewed graph as of now. Yeah, because it is actually it is too many positive outliers or billionaires and it's positively skewed.
Can you just bring the mic a little?
Okay. And what I'm saying is that the present income distribution graph of per capita income of graph of India is positively skewed because of billionaires was on the positive side. So that means it is not favorable. My question is, all major economics like US, everywhere it is so not. That's my question. So is there a way, if development has to be there, some inequality will be there along with it. Is there an ideal example that we can show to correct these issues? That's my question.
Well, there's, listen, one is not saying that you want a society in which everybody gets the same, that there's no inequality of any kind whatsoever. You might have a dream of that kind, but that's not what, essentially what you're trying to say is that, is the growth path a path in which, out of the increments in income, the distribution of those increments are such that pre-existing inequality gets reduced to a certain extent. Because in market economies, you cannot completely get away with inequalities. If there's private property, there's going to be inequalities, and if there's inheritance, there's going to be even more inequality, okay? So we can't get rid of inequality, but what you're trying to say is that the growth trajectory must be a growth trajectory such that if I take the different deciles of the population, different, percentiles of the population, then those who are getting less should be able to register a larger share of the incremental income, which is so that there is a degree of egalitarianism, or at least you don't worsen inequality. So that's the, an egalitarian growth path is not a growth path in which everybody gets, 100,000 rupees a year or whatever, or a month or whatever it may be. That's not what it is.
Thank you, sir.
We can have 2 more questions.
Hello sir, I'm Jose John, scholar from School of Management Studies. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. So impressed with the idea and so concerned with the centralization happening right now. My question follow up to the other 2 questions, and I'm just curious to know what is the trajectory of centralization, so that do we end up in an ideal situation where the baton of democracy... Sir, am I audible?
Yeah.
So the baton of democracy moved from the government to corporates, so that in future the welfare activities that are done by the government may shift to a corporate perspective, and the corporates coming with welfare activities to bridge the gap of the inequality. Is that a trajectory of the centralization, or is it something worse than that? Because what I believe is that even though the political leadership in the center change, there will not be any great changes happening to this idea of centralization. So what do you think? Are we going to expect a greater corporate governance in India, or a capitalist economy?
What I was trying to suggest is that there's a coalescence of the state and private capital. The electoral bond scheme is a clear example, You're actually saying that I want corporate funding, and I want corporate funding which is relatively anonymous, and in practice you find that, what did you think about corporate funding earlier? That the corporates will give a little bit of money to everybody, so that whoever comes to power, they'll be okay. But we now know that 90% of the money goes to one destination, So that's actually a coalescence of the state and private capital, So I don't think this would necessarily operate in terms of the corporate sector taking over everything, including maybe poverty reduction schemes. That's not what it is. It is that everything will get controlled by the need to actually ensure that there is this process of accumulation at the top end, till such time as you could sustain it. Now, there's only one thing I'd like to say. You see, after all, if you look at the period of welfare capitalism in globally, which was the period particularly after the Second World War, right up to about the 1970s, the end of the 1960s, the inspiration of which came from the New Deal and Keynesianism. And where did Keynesianism and the New Deal come from? It came from the Great Depression. Keynes could have written his book, but if the depression hadn't happened, it's unlikely that Keynes would have been picked up. Okay. Now, what one would have thought then is that if you had a crisis of the 2008 kind, in some sense, the dominance of finance in global capitalism would get weakened and undermined. That didn't happen. So what we're saying is, we don't even now know what
the intensity of the crisis has to be before, things can change. I mean, take Sri Lanka. The people came on the street and threw out a government, which actually, drove them into that crisis. That government then puts their representative, who himself is not elected to parliament. He's just a nominated member to parliament because of the the party list. And he now is implementing all of what they want to implement, independent of that massive crisis which still pervades as far as the people is concerned. So we don't even know now how far the system will go before it gives. But in the interim, it's actually a coalescence of private capital in the state.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you so much, Chandrasekhar sir. So, we'll continue the session. And thank you for patiently answering all the questions from the audience. Today we have with us Professor P.K. Michael Taragan, who has had a long association with Professor K.K. George during his career. Professor Michael is a chairman of Kerala Council for Historical Research. We invite you, sir, to share a few memories about Professor K.K. George.
Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar and friends, I'm very happy to be associated with this function because it is an attempt at remembering the kind of work and contributions that Professor K.K. George has done to the academic community in general, as well as to the general community as well. Professor George was not only a very close friend of mine, but a person whom I could, in any situation, depend upon. That was his hallmark. He, with a smile, he will face any problem for you. I mean, it may not be a problem which has anything to do with him personally, but even then he would be very deeply involved in trying to solve the issue for others. And I'm sure that I'm in a crowd where most of you will be having good memories, great memories of K.K. George, and it's not necessary to speak much upon his life and times. In fact, he left behind an institution which is of course involved in organizing this lecture. I have to say a word, at least a word about Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar. Though much younger to me, we started working together and on the same day joined the Center for Development Studies. I'm sure that Chandrasekhar went far ahead of what I could ever do. That is evident. We all know his ability to express very clear truths which we all feel, but we find it very difficult to express in terms of acceptable, in an acceptable manner. In fact, his writings, his lectures, I myself didn't have much chance to listen to his lectures, but I've been following whatever he was writing, and of course popular writings also in journals. And it has always surprised me that, these are issues which I myself felt very deeply, but didn't find ways of expressing with the clarity and strength that Chandrasekhar brings to the discussion. It's a very fortunate thing that we have got him to deliver this lecture, and this lecture has not only benefited us in terms of the knowledge and information that he passed on, but also evoking the contributions that K.K. George did in this field long ago, not so long ago. So on behalf of all of you, I would take this opportunity to thank Chandrasekhar for his brilliant presentation and pay my own homage to K.K. George. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I invite Mr. Krishna Kumar KK, Senior Fellow, CSES, who was also the student and has accompanied Professor KK George in his personal and professional journey to recollect and share some of his memories. Sir, please.
Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, Professor Michael Taragan, Dr. S. Muralidharan, മറ്റ് പ്രിയപ്പെട്ട വേദിയിലും മുൻപിലിരിക്കുന്ന സുഹൃത്തുക്കളെ, അധ്യാപകരെ, വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളെ, ജോർജ് സാറുമായിട്ടുള്ള ബന്ധം തുടങ്ങുന്നത് ജോർജ് സാറിൻ്റെ സ്റ്റുഡൻ്റായിട്ട് സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് മാനേജ്മെൻറ്റ് സ്റ്റഡീസിൽ വെച്ചിട്ടാണ്. അതിനുശേഷമാണ് അറിയുന്നത് ഞങ്ങൾ നാട്ടുകാരാണെന്ന്. പിന്നീട് SMS നിന്നും പുറത്തു വന്ന് സെൻറ്റർ ഫോർ സോഷ്യോ-എക്കണോമിക് ആൻഡ് എൻവയറൺമെൻറ്റൽ സ്റ്റഡീസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന സ്ഥാപനം തുടങ്ങുന്ന സമയത്താണ് പിന്നെ സാറുമായിട്ടുള്ള ബന്ധം ദൃഢതരമാവുന്നത്. CSESൻ്റെ ഡയറക്ഷൻ നിശ്ചയിക്കുന്നതിലും കേരള സമൂഹത്തിനുള്ള അതിനുള്ള സംഭാവനകൾ എന്തായിരിക്കണം എന്ന് പറയുന്നതിലും എന്തായിരിക്കണം എന്ന് തീരുമാനിക്കുന്നതിലും സാറിൻ്റെ പങ്ക് ഒരിക്കലും മറക്കാൻ കഴിയില്ല. ഞാൻ അധികം ദീർഘിപ്പിക്കുന്നില്ല, രണ്ട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ മാത്രമേ ഞാൻ പറയാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നുള്ളൂ. സാറ് കാലങ്ങളായിട്ട് പറഞ്ഞു വരുന്ന, എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷനുകളെ പറ്റിയും ഫെഡറലിസത്തെ പറ്റിയും ഇത്രയധികം പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുള്ളത് കേരള കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റുമായിട്ട് ചേർത്തിട്ട് ഇത്രയധികം ആരെങ്കിലും പഠിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടോ എന്ന് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നില്ല. അദ്ദേഹം ആദ്യത്തെ ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷനുകൾ മുതൽ അവസാനത്തെ കഴിഞ്ഞ ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷൻ വരെയുള്ള സമയത്ത് പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ടിരുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ ഇപ്പോൾ സംഭവിച്ചുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്. ഏറ്റവും പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട അദ്ദേഹം പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ടിരുന്ന 1971 പോപ്പുലേഷൻ എന്നുള്ളത് കഴിഞ്ഞ ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷൻ, അതായത് 14ാം ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷൻ, അത് ലോക്കൽ ഗവൺമെൻറ്റ്സിനുള്ള ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷൻ വിഹിതം കണക്കാക്കുന്നതിൽ 2001 പോപ്പുലേഷൻ എടുത്ത കാലത്ത് മുതൽ അതിന് മുമ്പ് മുതൽ പറയുന്ന ഒരു കാരണവശാലും 1971 പോപ്പുലേഷൻ എടുക്കാത്തൊരവസ്ഥ വന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ കേരളത്തെ അത് വളരെ ഗുരുതരമായിട്ട് ബാധിക്കും എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. 15ാം ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷനിൽ അത് നമ്മൾ നേരിട്ടറിഞ്ഞു. 2% താഴെയായിട്ട് കേരളത്തിൻ്റെ വിഹിതം കുറഞ്ഞു. 3.5% ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നത് 2% താഴെയായിട്ട് കുറഞ്ഞു. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷനുകളുടെ ഭരണഘടനാപരമായ ചുമതലയെപ്പറ്റിയും അദ്ദേഹം വളരെ ആശങ്കാകുലനായിരുന്നു. ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷനുകൾ കേന്ദ്രത്തിനും ഇപ്പോൾ പ്രൊഫസർ C.P. ചന്ദ്രശേഖർ ചൂണ്ടിക്കാണിച്ചതുപോലെ ഒരു ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻറ്റ് ബോഡി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആർബിട്രേറ്റീവ് ബോഡിയായിട്ട് നിലനിൽക്കേണ്ട ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷനുകൾ സെൻട്രൽ ഗവൺമെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂഷനായിട്ട് മാറുന്ന ഒരവസ്ഥയുണ്ടായി. അതിനെപ്പറ്റി വളരെ ആശങ്കാകുലനായിരുന്നു. ഈ രണ്ട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ ഇപ്പോൾ വളരെ കൃത്യമായിട്ട് സംഭവിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞു. ഫെഡറലിസം തകർന്ന രീതിയിലേക്ക് മാറിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്. ഈ രണ്ട് കാര്യത്തിലും അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പഠനങ്ങൾ വളരെ നിർണായകമായിട്ടുള്ള കണ്ടെത്തലുകൾ നടത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ കേരളത്തിന് മറ്റൊരു പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട കാര്യം, കേരള കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ നിന്നുകൊണ്ട് കേരളത്തിൻ്റെ സെക്കൻഡ് ജനറേഷൻ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് അഡ്രസ്സ് ചെയ്യേണ്ട കാലമാണ്. അതിന് ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷണർ ഇപ്പോൾ പോകുന്ന രീതിയിൽ പോയി കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമുക്കത് അഡ്രസ്സ് ചെയ്യാൻ കഴിയില്ല എന്നും. അപ്പോൾ അതിനുവേണ്ടി തന്നെ അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു സ്റ്റഡിയിൽ മുമ്പോട്ട് വെച്ച ഒരു കാര്യമാണ് ഗ്രീൻ ഫണ്ട് എന്നുള്ള ഒരു കൺസെപ്റ്റ്. അത് കേരള ഗവൺമെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ മെമ്മോറാണ്ടത്തിൽ ഉൾപ്പെടുത്താനും ആ സമയത്ത് കഴിഞ്ഞു. അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ കേരളത്തിന് ഏകദേശം കഴിഞ്ഞ ധനകാര്യ കമ്മീഷൻ്റെ സമയത്ത് ഏകദേശം 8,000 കോടിയോളം രൂപ കേരള ഗവൺമെൻറ്റിന് ആ ഒരു കാറ്റഗറിയിൽ വാങ്ങിച്ചെടുക്കാൻ കഴിഞ്ഞു. അത് കേരളത്തിന് ലഭിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള അക്കാഡമിക് കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷൻ വഴി ലഭിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള ഏറ്റവും വലിയ സംഭാവനയായിട്ടാണ് ഞാൻ കാണുന്നത്. അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് എല്ലാവിധ ജോർജ് സാറിനെ ഈ അവസരത്തിൽ ഓർമ്മിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് CSESന്റെ ഭാവിയിലുള്ള പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങൾ അദ്ദേഹം കാണിച്ച ഡയറക്ഷനിൽ തന്നെ പോകും എന്ന് വിചാരിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് നിർത്തുന്നു. നമസ്കാരം.
Thank you, sir. Now for a formal vote of thanks, I invite Dr. S. Muralidharan, Vice Chairperson, CSES, and Faculty Member, K.N. Raj Center, MG University.
ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, Professor Michael Taragan, and Krishna Kumar and other faculty members and dear students. ആരും ഇനി എഴുന്നേറ്റ് പോകണ്ട, ഞാനത് വേഗം അവസാനിപ്പിക്കാം. ഒരു ജോർജ് സാറിനെ പോലെയുള്ള ഒരു വലിയ മനുഷ്യനെ ഓർക്കുന്നത്, അദ്ദേഹം എന്തിനാണോ വർക്ക് ചെയ്തത് ആ വർക്കിനെ കുറിച്ച് തന്നെ അനുസ്മരിക്കുന്നത് സാറിനെ അനുസ്മരിക്കുന്നതിന് തുല്യമാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ആ അർത്ഥത്തിൽ പ്രൊഫസർ ചന്ദ്രശേഖർ ഇന്ന് ചെയ്ത പ്രഭാഷണം അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷനെ അനുസ്മരിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ മഹത്വത്തെ നമ്മൾ ഓർമ്മിപ്പിച്ച പ്രൊഫസർ C.P. ചന്ദ്രശേഖറിന് CSESൻ്റെ പേരിലും SMS-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും K.N. Raj സെൻ്ററിൻ്റെ പേരിലും ഞാൻ നന്ദി പ്രകാശിപ്പിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് പ്രോട്ടോകോൾ അനുസരിച്ച് വൈസ് ചാൻസലറെ വേണം ആദ്യം ഓർമ്മിക്കേണ്ടതെന്ന് എനിക്കറിയാം. വളരെ അടുപ്പം ഉണ്ടായിരുന്ന സുഹൃത്ത് തന്നെയായിരുന്നു. സാധാരണ വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ ഇത്തരം ഒരു ഫംഗ്ഷന് വരുന്നത് ബൈ ഒഫീഷ്യൽ കപ്പാസിറ്റിയിലാണ്. പക്ഷേ ഇതിപ്പം നമുക്കതിനപ്പുറം ജോർജ് സാറിനെ അടുത്തറിയുന്ന, ദീർഘകാലമായി അറിയുന്ന, ഒരു പക്ഷേ നമുക്ക് ചിലപ്പം ഒരു 4ാമത്തെ 5ാമത്തെ ലെക്ചറിനൊന്നും അങ്ങനെ ഒരാളിനെ കിട്ടണമെന്നില്ല. അപ്പം അങ്ങനെ ഒരു മഹനീയ സാന്നിധ്യം ഉണ്ടായ വൈസ് ചാൻസലറിനും CSSൻ്റെ പേരിലും SMS-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും K.N. Raj സെൻ്ററിൻ്റെ പേരിലും നന്ദി പ്രകാശിപ്പിക്കുകയാണ്. പിന്നെ വളരെ എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു മൈക്കൽ തരകൻ സാറ് ഇടയ്ക്ക് ഇച്ചിരി വൈകാരികമായോ, കാര്യം ജോർജ് സാറുമായുള്ള അടുപ്പം അത്രത്തോളം ഉണ്ടായിരുന്ന സെൻറ്റർ ഫോർ ഡെവലപ്മെൻറ്റ് സ്റ്റഡീസിലല്ല, സാറ് അവിടെ വിട്ടതിന് ശേഷം സാറിൻ്റെ അക്കാഡമിക് ആക്ടിവിറ്റി കൂടുതലും ജോർജ് സാറുമായിട്ടായിരുന്നു CSES-ലൂടെ. അപ്പോൾ അങ്ങനെ ജോർജ് സാറിനെ അനുസ്മരിക്കാൻ ഏറ്റവും അടുത്ത ഒരു അക്കാഡമിക് സഹപ്രവർത്തകനെ തന്നെ കിട്ടി എന്നുള്ളത് മറ്റൊരു ഭാഗ്യമാണ്. അതുകൊണ്ട് CSES-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും SMS-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും K.N. Raj സെൻ്ററിൻ്റെ പേരിലുള്ള നന്ദി പ്രകാശിപ്പിക്കുകയാണ്. പിന്നെ അദ്ദേഹത്തെ അനുസ്മരിച്ചത് കൃഷ്ണകുമാറാണ്. കൃഷ്ണകുമാറിന് ജോർജ് സാറിൻ്റെ പേരിൽ നന്ദി പറയുക എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഇച്ചിരി അധികപ്പറ്റാണ്. പക്ഷെ എന്നാലും പറയാതിരുന്നാലും ഒരു മര്യാദയോടുമാണ്. അപ്പം അതുകൊണ്ട് അദ്ദേഹത്തെ പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് പെർട്ടിനൻ്റായിട്ടുള്ള, എപ്പോഴും സാറ് ഫിനാൻസ് കമ്മീഷൻ്റെ റോളിനെ കുറിച്ച് പലപ്പോഴും വ്യാകുലപ്പെടാറുണ്ടായിരുന്നു, പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് കേരളത്തിൻ്റെ കോണ്ടക്സ്റ്റിൽ. അത് സാന്ദർഭികമായി ചൂണ്ടിക്കാണിച്ച പിന്നെ കൃഷ്ണകുമാറിനും SMS-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് CSES-ൻ്റെ പേരിൽ പറയുന്നത് ശരിയല്ലല്ലോ. കേന്ദ്ര സെൻറ്ററിൻ്റെ പേരിലുള്ള നന്ദി പ്രകാശിപ്പിക്കാം. നമുക്ക് ഒരു സദസ്സിൽ ഒരു 8-10 കസേരയെ കൂടുതൽ ഇടാൻ പറ്റില്ല. പക്ഷേ ഈ കസേരയിൽ ഇരുത്തേണ്ട പലരും നമ്മുടെ മുന്നിൽ ഇരിപ്പുണ്ട്. അത് ഞാൻ അല്ല, അതിൻ്റെ പ്രായക്കൂടുതലോട് ക്ഷമിക്കുക. ആദ്യം ജോർജ് സാറിൻ്റെ അനുസ്മരണം നടത്തി സംസാരിച്ച അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ വിദ്യാർത്ഥിയും ജോർജ് സാറിനെ മെൻ്ററായും കണക്കാക്കുന്ന പ്രൊഫസർ ജഗതി പി രാജനും CSES-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് SMS-ൻ്റെ പേരിൽ വേണ്ടല്ലോ, KNDASൻ്റെ പേരിലുള്ള നന്ദി പ്രകാശിപ്പിക്കുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ വിട്ടുപോകാൻ പാടില്ലാത്ത രണ്ടുപേരും ഇവിടെ ഇരിപ്പുണ്ട്. ജോർജ് സാറിൻ്റെ സഹധർമ്മിണി ഇവിടെ ഇരിപ്പുണ്ട്. അതുപോലെ മകൾ ആൻ ജോർജ് ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പം അവരെ മകൻ പിന്നെ ജസ്റ്റിനുണ്ട്. സോറി, ഞാനത് ആദ്യം ശ്രദ്ധിച്ചില്ല. അപ്പോൾ എല്ലാ കുടുംബങ്ങൾക്കാണ് ഒരുമിച്ച് നന്ദി പറയുന്നത്. CSES-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും SMS-ൻ്റെയും സെൻറ്ററിൻ്റെയും പേരിൽ പ്രകാശിപ്പിക്കുകയാണ്. ഇത് കൂടാതെ നമുക്കൊരു കൂടുതൽ കസേര ഇടാൻ പറ്റില്ല. കാര്യം സുകുമാരൻ സാറുണ്ട്. ജോർജ് സാറുമായിട്ട് വളരെ ഞാൻ കണ്ടിട്ടുള്ളത്, ജോർജ് സാറുമായിട്ട് സുകുമാരൻ സാറ് ഈ ഗൗരവത്തോടെ സംസാരിക്കുന്ന കണ്ടിട്ടില്ല. വളരെ കാഷ്വലായി, വളരെ പിന്നെ എന്താ ചിരിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് വർത്തമാനം പറയുന്നത്. അത്രത്തോളം വളരെ തിക്കായ അക്കാഡമിക് കാര്യങ്ങൾ. കാര്യം അതിലൂടെയാണ് ഞാനും മാത്യു സാറും ഒക്കെ ഇവരുടെ രണ്ടുപേരുടെയും ശിഷ്യത്വത്തിലാണ് ഞങ്ങളുടെ ഗവേഷണം. അപ്പം ഈ സമയത്ത് അവർ രണ്ടുപേരും ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് നൽകിയ ഗവേഷണത്തിന് നൽകിയ ശക്തി നന്ദിയോടെ സ്മരിക്കുകയാണ്. CSES-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും SMS KNDAS സെൻറ്ററിൻ്റെ പേരിൽ ഹരികുമാർ സാറുണ്ട്. ഇനിയിപ്പോൾ അങ്ങനെ പേര് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരു ഗാലക്സി ഓഫ് പിന്നെ CBS-ലെ സന്തോഷ് സാറുണ്ട്. അപ്ലൈഡ് എക്കണോമിക്സിലെ 3 സ്റ്റാൾവേർഡ്സ് അത് കൂടാതെ ഇരിപ്പുണ്ട്. മഹാരാജാസ് കോളേജിൽ നിന്നുള്ള ഫാക്കൽറ്റി മെമ്പേഴ്സ്, എല്ലാവരുടെയും പേര് പറയുന്നില്ല കേട്ടോ, ക്ഷമിക്കണം. പിന്നെ ഭാരത് മാതാ കോളേജിലെ മിസ്റ്റർ നിതിൻ ഈസ് ദയർ. ഇനി ഞാൻ ആരെങ്കിലും SMS-ലെ തന്നെ ഫാക്കൽറ്റി മെമ്പേഴ്സ് ഉണ്ട്. എല്ലാവരെയും പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് എടുത്ത് പറയുന്നില്ല. അതിനും അപ്പുറം ഇതിലേക്ക് വന്ന വിവിധ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിലെ തന്നെ അപ്ലൈഡ് ഇക്കണോമിക്സിലും സെൻറ്റർ ഫോർ ബഡ്ജറ്റ് സ്റ്റഡീസിലും SMS-ലെയും വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളും റിസർച്ച് സ്കോളേഴ്സും ഉണ്ട്. പിന്നെ CSES-ലെ തന്നെ മെമ്പേഴ്സുണ്ട്. നിങ്ങളോട് പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് നന്ദിയൊന്നും പറയുന്നില്ല. അപ്പോൾ വിവിധ കോളേജുകളിൽ നിന്ന് ഭാരത് മാതാ, മഹാരാജാസ് കോളേജ്, പിന്നെ ഏതെങ്കിലും കോളേജ് വിട്ടുപോയിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ക്ഷമിക്കണം. അങ്ങനെ സന്നിഹിതരായ എല്ലാ ആളുകൾക്കും CSES-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും SMS-ൻ്റെ പേരിലും KNDAS സെൻറ്ററിൻ്റെ പേരിലും ഞാൻ മനഃപൂർവ്വം എൻ്റെ വ്യക്തിപരമായ നന്ദി പറയാത്ത. കാര്യം ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂഷൻ്റെ മതി. ഇത്രയും നേരം ക്ഷമയോടെ കാത്തിരുന്ന എല്ലാവർക്കും, കേട്ടുകൊണ്ടിരുന്ന എല്ലാവർക്കും ഒരിക്കൽ കൂടെ നന്ദി പ്രകാശിപ്പിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് നിർത്തുന്നു. കൂടുതൽ പറയുമ്പോൾ നിങ്ങൾ ഉപദ്രവിക്കുമായിരിക്കും. നമസ്കാരം.
Thank you, sir. Here we come to an end to the formal function. Thank you for being a part of this session. Thank you.